1994, Dimebag Darrell stood in front of a wall of gleaming Randall amplifiers at the NAMM show in Anaheim, his signature pink goatee catching the spotlight as photographers clicked away. The endorsement deal had been signed just months earlier, hundreds of thousands of dollars, a signature amplifier series, worldwide promotional appearances. Randall Amplifiers was positioning the Century 200 as the future of heavy metal tone, engineered specifically to capture that crushing Pantera sound that had dominated the metal world since Cowboys from Hell exploded in 1990. But back in Dallas, in the cramped rehearsal space where Pantera had birthed some of the most devastating riffs in metal history, three vintage Randall solid-state heads from the 1980s sat waiting, their circuits still warm from the previous night's tracking session. What the Randall executives celebrating their new partnership with one of metal's most influential guitarists didn't know was that Dimebag Darrell had just begun one of the most elaborate equipment deceptions in heavy metal history, and he would maintain it until his final days. Before we explore this untold story further, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind metal's greatest legends, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the stories that shaped heavy music, the secrets that were meant to stay buried in the studio. The relationship between Dimebag Darrell and Randall Amplifiers was already embedded in metal mythology long before the 1994 endorsement deal. Since the late 1980s, when Diamond Darrell was still cutting his teeth on the Texas club circuit, guitarists worldwide had been trying to decode the crushing, razor-sharp tone that defined Pantera's sound. That tone, thick as molasses but sharp enough to slice through the heaviest rhythm sections, came from a combination of Dimebag's customized Dean ML guitars, his carefully tweaked solid-state Randall RG100s, and a recording technique that involved multiple amplifier combinations that he guarded as carefully as a magician guards his best illusions. Those original Randalls weren't just equipment to Dimebag. They were battle-tested weapons. The sonic foundation of the groove metal revolution he and his brother Vinnie Paul had engineered from their Dallas home base. But by the early 1990s, the landscape of music equipment endorsements was shifting dramatically. Pantera had ascended from underground phenomenon to mainstream metal giants. Vulgar display of power had gone platinum. Far Beyond Driven would debut at #1 on the Billboard charts in 1994. Suddenly, equipment manufacturers were willing to pay extraordinary sums to have their names associated with the Abbott brothers and their crushing sound. Randall Amplifiers, looking to solidify their position in the increasingly competitive high-gain amplifier market, approached Dimebag with an offer that included not just significant money, but the opportunity to design his dream amplifier from scratch, incorporating all the features he had been requesting for years. The contract was signed in early 1994, and by spring, Randall engineers were making regular trips to Pantego Sound, the studio Vinnie Paul had built, measuring, testing, and attempting to capture that Pantera tone in a production amplifier. What those engineers didn't fully comprehend was that every time they visited the studio, Dimebag was performing an elaborate shell game that would have made a Las Vegas card shark proud. The new Randall Century prototypes were always prominently displayed, always plugged in, always ready for demonstration when company representatives were present. But the actual tracking, the real recording of guitar parts that would appear on the Great Southern Trendkill and later albums, was happening through a completely different signal chain, one that terminated at those hidden vintage RG100 heads that Dimebag had been using since the Cowboys from Hell era. The deception required meticulous planning and the cooperation of Dimebag's trusted inner circle. Grady Champion, the guitar tech who had been with Dime since the early Pantera days, became an essential accomplice in the scheme. Whenever Randall representatives were scheduled to visit Pantego Sound, The vintage RG100s would be carefully relocated to a back room, concealed behind road cases and miscellaneous equipment. Cable routing would be changed to run through the new Century heads. Even the studio documentation was staged to show the new Randall models in the signal chain. It was theater, meticulously choreographed and executed with the same precision Dimebag brought to his guitar solos. Dime understood that endorsement deals were constructed on perception and brand association, and as long as Randall believed their new amplifiers were creating the Pantera sound that was crushing the competition, everyone could maintain a profitable relationship. The Randall Century 200 amplifier that eventually hit the market in 1995 was, by all technical accounts, a formidable piece of equipment. Randall's engineers had worked exhaustively to create a high-gain beast that could deliver the scooped mid-range and aggressive tight low end that characterized mid-1990s extreme metal. It became enormously popular, especially among the emerging death metal and metalcore scenes. Bands like Lamb of God and Unearth would later credit the Century series with helping them achieve their signature tones. But the brutal irony was that the amplifier bearing Dimebag Darrell's name and endorsement had very little to do with the actual sound Dimebag Darrell was creating on Pantera Records. The Century was a marketing triumph built on a sonic deception. The truth began seeping out through whispers in the tight-knit metal production community. Studio engineers who worked on Pantera albums during the mid to late 1990s started sharing stories in audio engineering circles and Metal Gear forums. One engineer, speaking on condition of anonymity, described a session during the Great Southern Trendkill recording in 1996, where Dimebag had insisted on complete privacy during guitar tracking. When the engineer entered the live room to check a cable connection, he discovered the Randall Century head that had been sitting prominently on display was actually powered down. The cables ran to one of the old RG100 heads that had been cleverly concealed inside a blank road case with the front panel removed. The microphones were positioned on a Randall cabinet from the old days, not the new Century cabinet that was visibly staged in the room. It was a masterwork of misdirection, so carefully constructed that even people who worked in the studio regularly could be fooled if they weren't paying extremely close attention. The technical reasons why Dimebag preferred his vintage Randalls were complex, but rooted in years of obsessive experimentation and modification. The old RG100 solid-state circuits had a particular compression characteristic that Dimebag had learned to manipulate through specific gain staging and cabinet combinations. He would often blend multiple amplifier heads, using one vintage RG100 for the core tone, another for additional mid-range bite, and sometimes even a tube amplifier for warmth. Modern amplifiers like the Century were engineered for consistency and predictable frequency response, to sound essentially the same, whether they were in a rehearsal space or a stadium. Dimebag's vintage Randalls were the opposite, temperamental, sometimes unreliable, but capable of producing a harmonic complexity that the more refined, more modern designs simply couldn't replicate. There was also the matter of Dimebag's extensive modifications. Over the years, he had experimented with different speaker combinations, adjusted internal components, and developed recording techniques that were specifically calibrated to those old amplifiers. His vintage Randalls were Frankenstein creations, just like his famous Dean ML guitars, modified beyond manufacturer specifications and utterly unique to his hands and ears. The relationship between Dimebag and Randall reached a complicated juncture around 1998. Rumors about Dimebag's continued use of vintage equipment had been circulating in guitar communities for years, but Randall had largely ignored them, focusing instead on the commercial success of the Century line, which was selling extremely well among younger metal guitarists. But when a detailed interview with Dimebag appeared in a major guitar magazine where he casually mentioned preferring his old Randalls for certain recording applications, Randall executives requested a clarification meeting. The conversation that followed at Pantego Sound was reportedly tense but ultimately cordial. According to sources close to the situation, Dimebag didn't outright deny using his vintage equipment. Instead, he explained his position with the kind of technical specificity that only a true gearhead could appreciate. He demonstrated the differences between the vintage and new amplifiers, explained his blending techniques, and made his case. The Century amplifiers were excellent products for their intended market: aggressive, reliable, affordable. But they were not, and could never completely replicate the sound he had spent over a decade developing with his vintage gear. The conversation grew heated briefly, with mentions of contractual obligations and marketing commitments. But Randall ultimately chose pragmatism over confrontation. The Century line was selling too successfully, and having Dimebag Darrels' name and image associated with their brand was worth more than technical accuracy about his precise studio methodology. The compromise that emerged was subtle but significant. From that point forward, Randall's promotional materials would feature Dimebag with their amplifiers, but the language became carefully calibrated. Phrases like Dimebag Darrell's signature sound replaced more direct claims about exclusive use. It was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy, allowing Randall to maintain the endorsement relationship while quietly acknowledging that the reality was more nuanced than the advertising suggested. Perhaps the most fascinating dimension of this entire saga is what it reveals about authenticity and perception in the music equipment industry. Thousands of young guitarists purchased Randall Century amplifiers, believing they were accessing the Pantera sound directly. And in a sense, they were. Just not the exact Pantera sound from the albums that had made them fans. They were getting the sound Randall engineers believed Dimebag should have, a modernized, more accessible version of something that was inherently idiosyncratic and difficult to replicate. Whether those guitarists felt deceived when whispers of the truth eventually spread is debatable. Many argued that the Century Series amplifiers were excellent in their own right, regardless of Dimebag's personal studio preferences. Others felt a sense of betrayal, believing they had been sold an incomplete picture. The equipment deception also illuminates Dimebag's complicated relationship with the commercial side of the music industry. On one hand, he was a revolutionary guitarist who had helped redefine heavy metal through technical innovation and fearless creativity. On the other hand, he was a working musician operating in an industry where endorsement deals provided crucial income, especially as album sales became less reliable in the late 1990s. The Randall endorsement kept Dimebag's name prominent in guitar magazines, music stores, and metal circles worldwide. But maintaining that endorsement while staying true to his actual sonic requirements forced him into an increasingly elaborate performance every time company representatives visited the studio. Vinnie Paul, in interviews conducted years after Dimebag's death in 2004, confirmed many aspects of his brother's equipment philosophy. Vinnie described Pantego Sound as having a massive collection of amplifiers, with Dimebag constantly experimenting with different combinations depending on what a particular song demanded. The old Randalls were always in rotation, Vinnie explained, because that's where Dime's real sound lived, in those circuits he understood intimately. The newer stuff got used, absolutely, Vinnie insisted, but for certain applications, for specific textures. When it came to those crushing rhythm tones that defined Pantera's heaviest moments, Dime always went back to the gear he trusted most. when Dimebag Darrell was murdered on stage on December 8, 2004. The tributes that poured in from around the world spoke to his immense influence on heavy music. Guitarists across generations discussed his technique, his tone, and his innovations. In those tributes, his equipment was mentioned frequently. The Dean ML guitars, with their lightning bolt graphics, the massive amplifier rigs, the obsessive attention to sonic detail. Notably, the specific amplifier models received less focus than the overall sound he had created, as if the metal community understood instinctively that Dimebag's genius wasn't contained in any single piece of equipment, but in how he combined and manipulated everything at his disposal. Today, any amplifier that Dimebag actually used, whether vintage Randall or Century Series, commands premium prices in the collector's market. But they are valued not because they contain some secret circuit that unlocks the Pantera sound, but because they were touched by Dimebag, used by Dimebag, modified by Dimebag. The vintage RG-100s that Dimebag used to record Pantera's most iconic albums remain in private collections, too historically significant and too valuable ever to be sold. Those amplifiers, scarred from the road, modified beyond recognition, are the real artifacts of Dimebag Darrell's sonic genius. The signature models were just the packaging, the commercial face of something far more complex and personal.